This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everyone, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 180 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. This episode is part of the National Literacy Month Reading is Fundamental series, which is a special effort that's being done between Reading is Fundamental and members of the B Podcast Network. Reading is Fundamental is a nonprofit that focuses on connecting educators and families with materials and training aligned with evidence-based literacy instruction. Not only is their model aligned with the science of reading, they also offer unique book ownership solutions for professionals and families to address book equity issues. You can learn more about Reading is Fundamental as well as the B Podcast Network in the show notes. So how this works is for the month of September, I am focusing on literacy. Obviously, this is a common topic that I address on this podcast, but I've got a special series going and I am publishing some extra episodes in the month of September as part of this effort. And then in October, we're going to resume our normal once a week schedule. Also, as part of this special campaign, I am offering my listeners 25% off when they join either the School of Clinical Leadership or Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. So this is between September 15th and October 15th. Language Therapy Advanced Foundations is my program that gives speech pathologists and other professionals working on language a framework for language therapy. To learn more about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. And the School of Clinical Leadership is my program that gives related service providers a framework for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. To learn more about the School of Clinical Leadership, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. And to get that special 25% off between September 15th and October 15th, all you need to do is enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page when you check out. And if you're already a member of either program and you refer a friend, I will give you a $100 referral bonus. All you need to do to get that bonus is have your friend email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com after they've joined, and I will set you up with that referral bonus. So now let's get to the episode. There is a disproportionate number of individuals with communication disorders and reading disabilities involved in the justice system. Past research suggests that more than 40% of incarcerated people have some type of nonpsychiatric disability. Additionally, once youth become involved with the justice system, it becomes more difficult for them to access the education and therapeutic services they need. Both literacy and language skills will impact someone's ability to comprehend employee or disciplinary handbooks, to read language and legal documents, fill out job applications, or explain past events during job interviews, when interacting with school staff, or even with law enforcement. Many times, things are written off as behavior problems when the real underlying issue could be tied to language, reading, or writing. That's why I invited Dr. Shamika Stewart to episode 180 of the De Facto Leaders podcast. Dr. Shamika Stewart is an associate professor of communication sciences and disorders and the juvenile forensic speech-language pathologist. Dr. Stewart is also a special education advocate trained by the Wright's Law Training Center. Her clinical and scholarly work specializes in juvenile forensics, law enforcement interaction with youth with communication disorders, child language disorders, and augmentative and alternative communication. Her primary research focuses on the confluence and impact of cognitive and communication disorders on the school to confinement pipeline, status offenses, involvement with the criminal justice system, law enforcement interaction, and criminal recidivism in youth placed at risk for delinquency and crime, especially Black and Brown youth from under-resourced areas. Dr. Stewart is also a clinically certified and licensed speech-language pathologist and is licensed to practice in Maryland, Washington, D.C., and multiple other states. In this conversation, we discuss the relationship between reading challenges and the school to confinement pipeline, why behavior problems could be related to language processing, reading, or writing challenges. When youth become involved with the justice system, how do they get access to special education services, including language therapy? The idea that kids should know better and why we can't assume kids comprehend language in the school discipline handbook, and a case for continuing direct language therapy in high school and why therapists need support from school leaders in making this happen. Be sure to check the show notes for all the resources mentioned in this episode. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Shamika Stewart. Today, I am joined by Dr. Shamika Stewart from the DC metro area. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me.
So I thought we could have you start off by just sharing a little bit about yourself, your background up to the work that you're doing now.
So I am an associate professor in communication sciences and disorders. I also have a Juris Doctorate in law, where I focus specifically in the areas of special education and juvenile law or youth justice area. I am also the first and only juvenile forensic speech and language pathologist in the US. Some people say the world, I don't know, because I'm only in the US. And I do special education advocacy as well.
Great. So I guess the first place to start would be, can you explain a little bit about what that means? What is a juvenile forensic SLP and what kind of work do you do?
So juvenile forensic speech language pathologist is slightly different from the existence of just forensic speech pathology, which we've had for years. And so in this capacity, in addition to just the forensic part of explaining how communication disorders can impact involvement with the criminal justice system, I also assess, analyze academic, medical, personal records, any records given to me, testify, write evaluation reports, and discuss the findings of that report to the courts, prosecution, and defense in reference to cases. Most of my cases are or have been capital cases in which the individual is facing either a life or death sentence, or I have had some habeas corpus cases, which means that the individual is in the process of or has exhausted their appeals. And so the cases, there's already been a sentence made, and this they're writing a motion to kind of have the case re-reviewed and allow the individual to discuss the individual's release. So it's almost like it's what we would call in the legal space a writ.
Okay. Yeah, I have so many different questions about that. Is just as far as the process. I mean, I know that coming from the schools, you hear about involvement with the justice system, but not to that extent. I guess, this is part of the reason we're talking is because I wanted to talk about some of the work that you do just in the conversation about literacy. I think we know that this is way more than just literacy. There's life outcomes, but I know that when we're talking about the conversation about learning to read, learning to write, having the language skills to be able to communicate through reading, writing, oral language that I don't know that there's a lot of awareness around the impact when we're talking about involvement with the justice system. So, yeah, I mean, maybe we can start off with the literacy and reading piece, but then get to
Mhm.
there's so much else, I'm sure, with the
Right.
process that you're going through. So, yeah, maybe we could start with reading.
Sure. So I think that's a good place to start because you always hear the conversation of prisons or jail cells are built based around the reading scores of third graders. And that's
Hmm.
been a narrative for a very long time. I, it's really important to make it known that that's not true. And so there is a correlation between reading and how it impacts an individual's involvement with the criminal justice system, but it's not first of all, just a reminder that most of the prisons have been built for years. So they're not building prisons and cells based off reading scores because they've already existed, unfortunately, for
Hmm.
years.
Yeah.
But what ends up happening is one, because a lot of incarceration happens in youth that are young. You have youth entering the space before they've even developed the academic skills that they need to be successful. And
Hmm.
then there's a very large population of individuals in adult carceral spaces who never received one, proper education, but two, the special education intervention that they needed. And a lot of that starts with the reading skills that, you and I as speech and language pathologists would address, that phonological awareness skills, the phonics, learning how to actually read in the code versus swallowing words whole. And
Hmm.
so because they leave the school space with limited literacy skills, the reading transcending to the writing, transcending to the comprehension, they're unable to be successful in society. And
Hmm.
so that ends up resulting in having to make alternate decisions about life. When you have, families that you have to take care of, or you're a young mother or father, or you have the responsibility of helping your mommy keep the household up, but you can't fill out a job application, then
Yeah.
your decisions are less than favorable, which then increases the risk of you being involved with the criminal justice system.
Yeah. I've never heard that before, what you said about that the prisons are built around the third grade. Like where does that come from? I mean, what is
Everybody, I don't, so everybody says it all the time. And it
yeah.
actually came from a senator doing a speech one time, and
Uh,
they insinuated something that got taken out of context, and that
okay.
has become the narrative. Like, whenever you talk to people about literacy in the criminal justice system, the first thing they say is it true that they build prison cells off of, and that's not actually what the senator said, and it's also just not actually true, but it's a running thing for years.
Hmm. So are suggesting that it happens like it starts in third grade? I mean, what was the intention of what he was trying to say? And then what did people think he meant?
So I think that the individual's intention was to discuss how pretty much that there's a correlation
Hmm.
between the standardized scores that you start to do, testing that you start to do in the third grade, and
Hmm.
how it can impact the trajectory of your
Yeah.
life.
Mm.
And I think that in the process of trying to explain that, it kind of came off like, oh, they're taking these scores from
Hmm.
these standardized tests and seeing like, okay, these kids are more likely to be involved with the system. And so we're building prisons off of these scores.
Mm. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of one of those correlation does not equal causation kind of arguments that got
Right.
taken too
Yes.
far. I mean,
We are.
yeah. So you mentioned a number of different things that where we do want to think about their trajectory. You talked about some things where it's okay, if you have adults and they're not able to fill out a job application, that does impact the choices that they would make. But what about if we maybe start and kind of go through the lifespan, just some of the things that you've worked with, or just some things that maybe people aren't aware of as far as, okay, we know that if you are struggling to read, that tends to sometimes school is a less than favorable experience for you. And part of that is that reading is difficult. So it's harder for you to be more successful in school. So there's the academic success piece. I guess I'm just curious what kind of, if we did start with that early elementary where you
Mhm.
are still focused on reading, it is on people's radar. Like what do you see happening at that age, and how does it change as you go through the lifespan?
Right. So I think that, a lot of times what happens is, unfortunately, the research and the researchers don't align with the ethnography of the individuals that they are touching. And so we lose sight of the fact that jobs are not only, for example, you said like jobs and adults. Jobs are not only for adults. Like for instance,
Yeah.
I started working at 13. And I mean, it started as summer youth program. And then, it went to when I was 15, able to actually work a job. And so some populations and cultures, children start work early at
Mm,
13. But
mm,
backing that back just a little bit, you have there's psychological and personal things that happens in the academic space that we don't always take into account. So besides me having difficulty learning to read or reading, we forget that as a young teenager, it also affects my reputation. And it's
mm,
embarrassing to not be able to read in front of this boy or girl, or for someone to know I can't read in front of my friends, and for me to look like the dumb one in the classroom. And so to avert those things, youth tend to present with what you and I know as avoidance behaviors. And those avoidance behaviors are what they are penalized for. So after a significant amount of avoidance behaviors, you are getting suspended, you're getting expelled, you may be sent to an alternative school, and then that starts the track. Because
hmm
instead of us digging into the fact of why you're presenting the behaviors you're presenting, most school spaces only focus on that behavior. And
hmm
so I may fight because when I come into this classroom and Dr. Brandon tells me that I'm going to have to read the next section and I know I can't read, I'm going to throw a piece of paper across the room to distract you from remembering to call me to read.
hmm
And that just starts the wheel and the cycle in high school. And so by the time they get to being able to support themselves or needed to support themselves, they went so long with avoidance behaviors that were looked at as problem behaviors
hmm
that it's unfortunately too far along for anything but now I'm facing the judge or now I'm facing juvenile detention spaces because of the decisions I've made.
hmm Yeah. So I would love to, I think a good place to go next would be just talking about disciplinary procedures in the schools and how we can handle that, or maybe like
Hmm.
handle them more productively in a way that's addressing the what's really going on. Like what, and just maybe some things that you've observed with, again, maybe kids getting suspended because they're acting out as avoidance, and
Hmm.
what's a more productive way that we could be
Yeah.
addressing that.
I think that, and I'll say this with a grain of salt because I get it. Most clinicians in an academic space are overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
They have a lot on their plate. So we're always looking to kind of cut professional ethic corners.
Mm-hmm.
We got too much to do. But ultimately, a lot of times when you're seeing the child who's getting the consistent dings, or they're always in the hallway, or they're, the person that is in on the dean's list or getting flagged, or that's the child that we need to be screening and assessing, because more than likely they should have been on your caseload.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's that first part. I've seen, there's many times I'm walking in, I see a child on a windowsill just hanging out. I'm like, why are you up there? And come to find out, that child should have been referred to me because of many other things that have happened that required speech and language intervention. So one is that correlation where I see a lot of times that even though we're in the academic space doesn't know our role and the capacity of our role. So it's like, oh, I didn't know because this child had a TBI that I should have told you as the speech and
Mm-hmm.
language pathologist. I'm like, are you serious? Like,
Yeah,
where have
yeah.
we been all week? But it's those little things of the disconnect between us, and because a lot of times we function in a silo,
Mm-hmm.
but it's because we have so much. So that's one part. The second part is that once we start to do assessments, I've seen, and I've been a clinician for 17 years. I try to keep, even when I'm part-time, I try to keep my clinical skills moving. And in all the school spaces I have been in, most of the time, I see that clinicians assess based on what was referred instead of doing a legal comprehensive assessment. And
Yeah.
the law says that the assessment is supposed to be comprehensive, not just Arctic because somebody referred for Arctic. And I think that sometimes we miss the mark on what the child needs because we're not assessing all areas. And that is a lot of the problem too. Like a lot of kids have gotten skipped over. Prime example, just this year, in February, I was assessing a young man. He was in the fourth grade, and avoidance behaviors, only thing for behaviors, I said I need to test him. I test him, and he tested on a kindergarten level for reading. He could not write at all. He could not even copy the letters you wrote. He didn't have any ability. And I'm like, how did he get to the fourth grade and he can't even identify or write a letter? He can't, this makes no sense. So there's these disconnects and I wasn't the first speech and language pathologist on his caseload from this school. So this
Yeah.
says this is a problem that we missed this whole mark. And this is our fault, me included as a profession, that we're doing this disservice of not assessing language and Arctic or speech and language at all times.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that part. I think the other part is once we start to do therapy, we don't also assess vocabulary all the time, which it should always be tested. But
Mm-hmm.
then we don't incorporate vocab into intervention, forgetting that students are held accountable to the disciplinary handbook. But 95% of the disciplinary handbook, a student cannot define the words in.
I never
So when
thought of
you
it that
tell me,
way.
if you pull out a word in the handbook and they couldn't tell you what disciplinary means, first of all, they can't tell you that, you can elect to do blank, blank, blank. So a lot of times when a person or a principal or someone is saying you should have known better, or you knew you couldn't do such and such and such, half the kids, especially that are on our caseloads, did not know.
Mm-hmm.
You're asking about what happens at home between Latinx families where they are second generation, which means their parents are first generation. There's a language barrier. The
Mm-hmm.
handbook is going home in Spanish or Arabic or Amharic, or they're coming from homes where their parents also had special education needs, and so they can't read it and decipher it, but we're holding them accountable to this handbook. And that
Yeah.
impacts them. So I think therapy also needs to include preparing you to be successful in school.
Yeah, that's the vocabulary piece is really interesting because I think so there's the vocabulary and the decoding where even if you're doing
Right.
language and articulation, you have to do a thorough evaluation of language, not just, well, the teacher said that they
Right.
can't comprehend. Well, why can't they comprehend? Is it
Mhm.
because they don't have the sentence structure, they can't decode at the word level, and
Exactly.
we're just assuming, oh, well, they're in high school. We're done with that.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. So yeah, I never thought about the disciplinary handbook that, yeah, I mean, the language in there that you could, I mean, some
Very
of
high
that,
level.
yeah, yeah. And I'm just even thinking how much that is even gone through with any of the kids, let alone
Any
the
of them.
students who
Right.
need special education. I mean, I'm sure if people really wanted a copy, they probably could get it, but is it in the right language? Is it in the
And think
vocabulary that they
about it.
understand?
If you're a great professor, most of the time when we teach a class, the first day, what do? We review our syllabus.
Yeah.
How many classes have you been in where the teacher reviewed the disciplinary handbook on the first day with the class? I can't count any.
Yeah. I don't think I don't, I don't even think I could tell you something from the disciplinary handbook for my high school, except we weren't supposed to wear tank tops.
Right.
So, that was only because it happened after I left and it was a new rule and people didn't like it. So
Right.
that's why it was on the radar, but it was a change. It wasn't
Yeah.
the status quo.
The things
So,
that's in there, right.
yeah. Well, and I think what else you said that is not just thinking about language and articulation, but other behaviors that we can observe that could be indicative of a processing issue or a learning problem that
Definitely.
look like behaviors. I mean that part too, where, oh, it's they're not academic, they're not language, they're a behavior issue. But
Right.
that
I
just,
can't stand that statement.
yeah.
It irks me when I see a clinician will, like on Facebook, a clinician will go through a whole scenario and say the child is doing it, and then someone will reply, "That's not your job. That's psychology because that's behavior." Behavior is communication. And if they are given a behavior, they're communicating something. And the only way to know that they're not communicating what falls in your scope of practice is to rule it out. That's the
Hmm.
whole point of differential diagnosis that we all had to take when we were getting our masters. You have to rule it out. It's either there or it isn't, but you won't know unless you test it.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it gets the further up you get in the grade levels, the harder it gets because there are cases where maybe you're collaborating with special ed and they
Mhm.
qualify under specific learning disability. And I'm definitely all about collaboration and consultation. And sometimes it's okay to consult instead of provide direct services. But I hate to just be like, speech is done in high school,
Mm.
like.
Yeah, no, that's the most important area for speech. Of anything, we need to be given speech and language services in the high school.
Mhm.
It shouldn't stop there. It should start there.
Yeah, that is a bigger staffing philosophical issue.
But it's an honest truth. Who
Yeah.
is the next set to go out into society? Not kindergartners,
Hmm.
not junior high school, high schoolers. So why would we not make sure that they're prepared and they are the next individuals to go out into society?
Yeah. I think there also needs to be more programming and scheduling changes because one of the biggest challenges that I had that I know other clinicians have had when they're trying to get services in at the high school, sometimes maybe like in my situation, I could easily make a case for it. It's not like
Mhm.
anybody was fighting me on saying, yes, they continue to qualify for speech, but then it's, okay, now I'm figuring out the schedule and I'm figuring out when I'm allowed to take this student out of, their other subjects and there's no time to do it. And I have 20 minutes every other week. And what am
Mhm.
I supposed to accomplish in that time when they have significant language issues still?
Yeah.
So there's some other bigger advocacy things to address there as well. I'm going to take a quick break here to talk about the School of Clinical Leadership and Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. As you're listening to the conversation, you're probably starting to realize how important it is for professionals to work on building their own skill sets for how they work directly with students, as well as understanding how systems work and putting strategic plans in place for working with the whole team because you can make a big impact with direct intervention, but you can make an even bigger impact if you take it a step further and also think about leadership and advocacy. So I help you do both things in the School of Clinical Leadership and Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. In Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, I help SLPs and other professionals working on language create a system for language therapy so they can walk into sessions confident that they're giving kids the skills that they need to succeed and that they're building those foundational language skills that support high level comprehension and literacy. To learn more about that program, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. Now, many of my language therapy advanced foundation students, once they start to get confident in their protocol, realize that they need to be collaborating with their teams. So that's really the next step. And many of them realize that they should be working on executive functioning as well. Now, there's plenty of executive functioning work embedded into language therapy advanced foundations because work on metacognition is so important to effective language intervention. But we also have to think about what the entire team is doing because students need support when they leave your room. And part of that is ensuring the right scaffolding is in place across the environments that students are in. And when we think about executive functioning, we have to think about more than just literacy and academics. We also have to think about how students self regulate, how they interact socially, and how they handle those unstructured situations during their school day, as well as outside of their school day. And you need a framework for navigating all of that because now Once we move beyond thinking about direct intervention, we're thinking about multiple service delivery models. And you need a framework for making that happen. I help you do that in the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. You can learn more about the School of Clinical Leadership at drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. As part of the Reading is Fundamental series, you can get 25% off either program, or actually both programs if you wanted to join both, between September 15th and October 15th. Just enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page when you're signing up to get this special rate. I am curious, so we have, we obviously want to do our job in the schools to identify students for services, identify the right services, but what about for those students who are involved with the justice system, especially if they're getting their schooling there? Just talking about, okay, how do we provide access to good education and then good services if they are already involved, especially if they're already incarcerated, and this could be in the youth or in adult corrections. How does that look?
Good question. So two things. Incarceration only happens if a youth has been tried as an adult. So if you are in a juvenile detention space, then you're just in what we call confinement. You can be incarcerated or imprisoned if you're in a prison or jail, which means you've been tried as an adult. So if you're tried as an adult, you no longer are considered a child. You're no longer entitled to education under the public education system. So services cease because you're not entitled to them anymore. If you're in a juvenile detention space, then the school, most of the times the detention spaces, the school inside of the detention space is a part of the public school system of that state. So that state's public school system has to provide the same services they were getting in the outside school. So the clinicians have to go into whatever clinicians work for that school system are assigned to continue the IEP that the youth has, as long as they're in that detention space as a youth. Now, the catch is that, unfortunately, because juvenile detention is considered a temporary holding process, there really is not an IEP team, and IEPs don't get changed in juvenile detention spaces. And so it's not actually that services are not being given, is that you left school, the outside school, with services that were not benefiting you. And you enter the juvenile space with services that still don't benefit you. And even if the clinician recognizes they don't benefit you, they can't change it because of short turnaround. And so then you leave with the same difficulties that you came in with. And that's really the bottleneck that happens in the juvenile space. Is it's really a outside public education system issue that we're not adequately identifying what the child needs. And so by the time they get to the detention space, it's not much you can change there.
Well, and the other thing that I've heard is that when there are people who are teaching, you will have third graders and eighth graders in the same classroom, or sometimes the classes don't count, or the teachers, again, they're not necessarily, it doesn't look like the public schools. It looks different. So I don't know if what's been your experience there as far as?
So they don't generally mix ages. So it's very rare that you're going to see a third grader in the same class with an eighth grader, unless that eighth grader is so low level that they need to be in that such class. Most times in the juvenile detention space, they are, preparing them for like GED, if that's going to be a thing. Now, there is this disconnect where the credits don't count. So it isn't that the classes are not being given, it's that the weight of the class doesn't change. So the youth may have been 17 when they entered and leave when they're 19, but nothing by the time they get out, that those credits that they got from those classes only push them up a semester. So they're still a junior when they get out, when they should have been graduated. And so that's the biggest disconnect, is that the credits don't hold the same weight because the rigor of them is not the same as the outside public school space, because they have to accommodate different needs and intellects in the space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that must be frustrating because it's like now you feel like you're even further behind, and if you're of age where you could get a job and you want to have a degree, you want to finish your GED, now you've got to
Right.
start the clock again, and
Yep.
so
And this is
yeah.
why you have recidivism, because most youth come out and realize that none of the credits that they took held that much weight. So it's like, what's the point at this point? I'm 21. I'm not about to sit in a 10th grade class with 15 and 16-year-olds. I'm going to drop out and I'm going to take an alternate route.
Mm-hmm. That's the age difference, like you said, where it's you don't really want to group kids with younger kids unless they need the skills at that
Mm-hmm.
level. So I'm just wondering socially and just like how would that make someone feel about going to school if they have to keep going to school with kids that are not in their peer group or the same age as them or significantly younger than them.
Most
That's
times, if they're older, they're not going to put them in a younger class. They'll, put them in a special education. So they have tiers like tier 1, tier 2, tier
hmm
3. They'll put them in
yeah.
a sped tier or put them in a smaller group of
hmm
like age peers and do the preparation for GED testing. Like I said, it's very, very, very rare that you'll see third and fourth graders, but it's also very rare that you'll see third and fourth graders in a juvenile detention space unless they've
Yeah.
done something significantly heinous.
hmm
So it's just not usually a thing that you even have to worry about. Most of the time, that juvenile detention space is going to start from about 13 to
hmm
about 21 years of age.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that that is I'm sure there's all kinds of different setups that that you might see. And I'm just wondering, like, ideally you would want, even if they are in a juvenile detention space, that you'd want the instruction to be tailored. You'd want teachers that, know how to teach reading or that know how to teach other skills. Like,
Mhm.
what kind of, when you're looking at the curriculum in public schools versus detention centers, like, what does the curriculum look like, I guess, would be my
It's very
question.
generic. It's very generic. It's not, you're not getting AP honors and all those
Yeah.
type of things. You're getting English, math, science, geography, social studies. And you're getting the core that you need that you would get in the academic space. And then we have that small set that goes to the special education space. There may be a reading specialist, those type of things. But again, that's based on staffing, budgets, and safety wise, because, some juvenile detention spaces are more secure than others because of the individuals housed in that space. So it just really depends on what can be done in the space. And a lot of times they can justify, not having those things based on those key factors of safety, because you have to keep, for instance, you don't only have to staff teachers, but you also
Right.
have to have correctional officers present. You got to have, somebody that can be in the room at all times, depending on the type of space or, security levels it is. So all of those things impact the factors of like, we can have these type of classes or this many classes and that stuff.
hmm
But
Yeah.
otherwise it functions like regular school. The bell rings, they change rooms. But it's the very basic level of teaching.
hmm Yeah. I wonder, so with I want to wrap up the reading and then I want to kind of go to just some of the other things that can be impacted by communication specifically.
Mhm.
But I mean, as far as if you have a student, let's say you've got an eighth grader and they're
Mhm.
still not able to decode and they're still struggling with the reading, what would reading intervention and literacy intervention look like as far as just the components and types of things that you would be working on? Does it just kind of depend on the teacher and the clinician that are involved with that
You mean
particular
in the
student?
space, in the
Yeah,
confinement
like
space, or
in the confinement space.
um again, reading specialists are not in every space. It
Yeah.
depends on the staffing and the budget. But if it is on their IEP,
Mm-hmm.
then the clinician will be treating that. So the psych, treats what they treat. The speech and language pathologist will treat whatever those goals are that are listed. Because again, remember, even if I see that you have
Yeah.
reading difficulties, I can indirectly address them, but I
Yeah.
legally have to only really target what's on your IEP. And
Yeah.
so we're being honest, most times those clinicians in that space are only targeting what's on the IEP.
So really, if you've missed identifying the real issue and then the student ends up in there, you can't adjust it
No,
once you get in there. Yeah, that's
there's no IEP team for that.
yeah.
Because they are still technically a student of the school they came from on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so they still belong to that public school system, and those decisions are still made outside.
Yeah. Kind of like you were saying before, where it's kind of looping.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. So with the obviously we know that literacy has a big impact, but there's so much more to it than that when we're talking about cognition and communication
Right.
and being able to have an interaction with someone and process what they're saying, um, being asked questions, being able to explain past events. So thinking about that, I would just love, to hear about your experiences with just having to advocate for students who maybe they had a diagnosis and maybe they weren't able to advocate or they didn't understand their rights. And I mean, what kinds of things do we need to think about from that standpoint?
Um, another good thought process. So the first thing is, especially with advocating for yourself, I always tread very lightly because you need parent permission
Yeah.
to empower, because I don't want to empower somebody's child beyond what they're comfortable with and place them at risk. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean that to say, especially for Black youth, because I can tell you your rights, but telling you your rights may also place you in danger if you're in front of an officer and you're saying, I know my rights, because we don't have the same interaction as Black people as, some other populations may have. So I always try to tread very lightly with talking about their rights as a whole and making sure I always get permission from parents if we're going down that route. I do, as far as understanding expectations of, following directions, why these things are important for you to know. Because there's things that you're going to have to do. Following the direction can look like this on the other side. And so those type of things I will do with my youth as far as keeping therapy very realistic to the correlation of their social life in the real world. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
not a big fan of the babies. Yes, I love the toys with the babies, but as it gets older, junior high school, I'm not a big fan of the commercialized interventions and things
Mm-hmm.
like that, because is not realistic for the populations I work with. And
Mm-hmm.
so, we have to do better at, even though it may make us uncomfortable or it feels like we shouldn't be having this conversation with them, keeping it 100.
Mm-hmm.
If you nickel and dime and you sell weed on the corner, listen, it's not my business, but let's talk about the problem solving of that. Let's walk
Yeah.
through it based on the fact that you have difficulties inferring, you have difficulties problem solving, and so you have not thought this all the way through. Let's talk about that. Let's use the skill you have towards something else.
Mm-hmm.
So we do those type of things. One of the things I tell my students, graduate clinicians, is that whatever you're seeing on the outside, that tip of the iceberg, is not what you actually need to be treating ever. So if the individual is having difficulties with following directions 9 times out of 10, it's because recall and working memory is impaired. So
Mm-hmm.
instead of you focusing on the iceberg, you need to be digging deeper to figure out what's causing this iceberg to pop out where it is. And I think that that's kind of the necessity, because a lot of times I see goals written for the surface.
Yeah.
And we treat the service, treat the service, treat the service, and wonder why the child never comes off a caseload, because you actually haven't addressed what the problem is. And if we start to address the problem, the base, excuse me, not a problem, difficulty, we may get to the root, rectify it, and change some things that can transcend or generalize across all of these areas where you're knocking out multiple icebergs at one time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I mean, there's when you're thinking about the working memory and the vocabulary and just the like thinking about, okay, well, they won't be able to answer the question. They won't be able to follow the direction on your following directions worksheet or whatever it is that you have.
Right.
Just how it actually is more efficient and
Hmm.
most important, it actually works and makes a difference.
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, when kids are just interacting just and they're having to just from the advocacy piece and understanding their rights, or just processing language,
Hmm.
or just again being able to retell what happened. I'm curious how that can play into, especially if like a youth is being interrogated or something like that, for example, like how from I guess there's the advocacy piece or just understanding how would that impact them in that situation?
So first and foremost, we should always be reminding youth that you should not be having a conversation with any adult without your parent
Yeah.
or attorney present. So there's no time that it's even okay to be questioned or interrogated without an adult present that has given you permission to have this conversation. Because that's another large sector of why youth end up being tried as adults. They've been coerced and, they falsely confess, or they've spoken about things that they should not have because they're easily impacted and intimidated. But I think, the conversation goes down to, understanding questions. And a lot of times I can watch an interrogation and tell you exactly where the child or the adult has cognitive difficulties because they didn't answer the question as it should have been answered, which says, oh, they had difficulty with WH questions and
Yeah.
nobody actually treated WH questions. Or, that and direction process. An officer is always looking for your behavior. Officers are trained to react to behaviors, not to words. So even if you're saying something, if you're stumbling over your words because it's fluency or it's processing or it's working memory, your stumble looks like lying or
Mm-hmm.
searching for the truth because I'm only watching your behaviors, your body language. I'm not listening to what you're saying to identify a disorder, which is why, that was really important for me to train officers on. But I think all of those little capacities of recognizing how your response or lack of response can be changed into an identifiable behavior and preparing youth to, even if you're not able to get it all out, to keep it simple or to say, give me a second because I got to process this. But
Mm-hmm.
giving them the words to be able to at least advocate for their need or their disability and explain it in a way that says, I need you to back for a second and
Mm-hmm.
give me a second to process because it's a lot. It's a lot to take in a heightened situation when you
Yeah.
got an officer in front of you, noise around you, people recording, whole bunch of people talking, and you trying to process when you have difficulties. It's not easy. So, getting them ready for that. And that means that as clinicians, we have to take therapy outside of the one-to-one room. So
Mm-hmm.
we really, really, really do a disservice when and let me again, in an ideal space, the way we do therapy is a disservice because life doesn't happen in a room one-to-one.
Mm-hmm.
That's that is the perfect scenario, but youth don't function in a perfect scenario. You got noise, you got people, you got distractions, you got colors, you got sounds and smells, and it's just me and you in the room. You're gonna do amazing in this room because
Mm-hmm.
it's just me and you. But
Yeah.
does it transcend to when you get back in the classroom, when you in the lunchroom, when you're walking down the hallway, because that's where the generalization has to happen. So therapy has to become more naturalized to happen in these spaces where it's noisy and things are happening so that I can really see where do you fall apart or where does it break down.
Yeah. Yeah. The that I think that's kind of the interesting piece is that hierarchy of where is that breaking point. And I'm sure
Hmm.
it's different for everybody.
Yeah, it's why like I always say, I'll see and it's like, oh, well, he has a goal for instance, fluency. He doesn't stutter when he's with me. Of course he doesn't. The situation's calm. It's
Yeah.
just you and him. You're
Yeah.
patient, you sweet, take your time, deep breaths. That's not, go see him when he in the lunchroom or
Mm-hmm.
pop up on his classroom when he in the middle of an argument with a peer and
Mm-hmm.
see if that fluency presents itself. That's going to tell you because that's their least restrictive environment. When they come into our therapy space, that becomes a restricted environment because it's too perfectly designed.
Yeah. Yeah, that is I think breaking out of that model of just, not that we should take away one to one, but
Right.
relying solely on that, I think
Yes.
is the biggest. And, it is really difficult because there's an expectation on anyone who is in that role, like, and this could be special ed teachers, the other therapists in the school as well, that that's almost what's expected. So there's a little bit of resistance if you want to do something a different way. Not always. I know that some clinicians who have said their special ed director or their teacher has said, well, we're doing all inclusion this year, where then, okay, we moved a little too far in the other direction for certain
Mhm.
kids, but just understanding that it can look different and there's not just this
Yeah.
one model of service delivery that is going
And
to work.
that's the important part. I think for me, I feel like there is no either or. It irks every nerve in my body that you have to check one of the boxes on the IEP. Is it inside or outside? It's
Oh, I
not an
know.
either
Yeah.
or. It's not, I feel like there's levels. And when you're teaching a child a skill, one-to-one in the therapy space, absolutely, because they need to learn it. But then
Hmm.
once they have stabilized the skill, the next step is generalization, which means we got to come out of this one-to-one and push
Yeah.
back into the class. It's not either one-to-one or push in, it's both, but they happen at different times.
Yeah. I'm curious if, I think a lot of people are afraid to push that boundary of, I checked this box, and I always would. I think that what was when I was in the schools, it was more about the time that I was
Mhm.
spending the time with the students. And I really didn't get pushback if I was going into a classroom or if I was pulling out of the classroom. It was, are these students being seen? But I don't know that
Mhm.
everybody has that same experience. I was always a ask for forgiveness rather than permission kind of person, but not everybody feels like they can
That
do
part.
that for a
And this
number of
that part.
reasons. Yeah.
And that you just said it. You said it absolutely. It's not about needing permission because you're the expert in that space. There is nobody else that has the expertise you have in this area but you. And so I would be remiss to allow you, not whoever else, to tell me how to do my job. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's not even a question of, is it okay or do you agree with it? It is, this is what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
This is what professionally works for me. I don't walk into the psych's office and tell the psych how to do her job. Don't tell me how to do my job. And if you care to, then you can come do my job when you get my credentials. And I
Yeah.
think that if more of us did that and stood up for ourselves, instead of then they and push back, like you said, then we would have less individuals trying to tell us what we can and can't do, because half the stuff that they tell clinicians that they can and can't do isn't true and it's not legal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I think there's some people just really don't understand special ed law. And I
Right.
think sometimes there's, or maybe it's a suggestion and not a directive. There's all kinds of things
Mhm.
you can get into, but yeah. Well, um, do you have anything else that we didn't cover? I know we kind of got into a lot of really good topics today, or just places people can go to learn more about your work and just some of the research you've done, or just some of the resources you offer.
Sure. So, my website, which is www.juveforensicslp.com. And then most of all of the courses, I do offer a special education law course, a lot of the transforming your language to write person positive evaluations. I do offer those type of courses. I usually advertise them on Instagram, my
Okay.
Instagram page. I do have a group on Facebook, and I don't think I share that with you, but it's a group where it's pretty similar. So if you're following me on Instagram, you don't need to follow the Facebook group as well unless you want to, because it's the information is shareable across both of them.
Yeah.
But the Facebook page is SLPs the number 4, juvenile justice. And you can follow there as well if you don't have an Instagram. But that's most of where I place all of my presentations, professional development courses, all of that type of thing.
Great. Well, we'll link to all of that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you for the invite. I really appreciate it. This is fun.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all of the links that were mentioned in this episode and where you can go to connect with our amazing guest. In this episode, I mentioned the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. You can learn more about that program at drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. And I also mentioned Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps SLPs create a system for language therapy. You can learn more about that program at drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. You can get 25% off either the School of Clinical Leadership or Language Therapy Advanced Foundations as part of the Reading as Fundamental series when you join either program, or actually you could join both programs if you want to, between September 15th and October 15th. All you need to do to get 25% off of either program or both programs is enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page when you sign up. Here's what you can do right now to support the Reading is Fundamental campaign and this special series that we're doing on De facto leaders. First, you can go to Apple or Spotify or any other directory you use for podcasts and subscribe to the De facto Leaders podcast. Once you listen to an episode or two, leave me a rating and review because that helps get my show into the hands of people who need the information. Finally, if you have a colleague or friend who needs to learn more about the research surrounding language and literacy, or you want to spread the word about practices and ideas you'd like to see in your school, community, or state, then tell them about De facto Leaders so they can listen to all of the episodes in this special series. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.